Good day, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. So this topic that I'm just about to unpack is very much synonymous with good corporate citizenship. And you may concur that we live and operate in a landscape that is continuously evolving. And the key questions that we need to be asking are, how are organizations going to be continuously compliant in this state of flux? How are ESG factors or ESG risks that pertain to ESG factors going to be mitigated? And how are companies going to derive value from all the practices that they have implemented within organizations? As indicated, the ESG regulatory environment is in a constant state of flux. And this poses a lot of risks meaning opportunities as well for organizations. Climate change is very prominent in 2024, and it's something that we need to take into consideration. So what's really happening around climate change is that a lot of organizations are really trying to make sure that they are climate resilient. And by so doing, they're assisting their clients and customers through their transitional journey towards the attainment of their sustainability goals, be it net zero, right? And there's also a lot of talk in 2024 around diversity and inclusion. And that happens at corporate level as well as at community levels. So there's a lot of talk around how do organizations or communities make sure that those that were previously excluded are now included in economic activities, as an example. There's a lot of talk around how do we make societies more equitable. At board level, questions are around how do we make boards reflective of the communities in which they operate. Their remuneration is on top of mind in terms of what is that remuneration supporting? Is it supporting long-term value creation or short-term value creation? Ethics, quite key as well. I mean, what is prominent these days is greenwashing. There's a lot of litigation around that. And gone are those days when the success of an ESG program was determined by the efforts of one entity. It's very important that we look at ESG efforts across the entire supply chain. There's also a lot of talk around impact investing, and that brings about opportunities for companies that strive to be good corporate citizens. Stakeholder engagement, quite key, on top of mind as well. And because there are challenges with an organization with respect to data, the quality of data, availability of data, that is also on top of mind because it impacts deliverables, it impacts what is being disclosed to different stakeholders out there. And that translates to whether a company gets investment or not. There's a lot of talk around technology. We're moving towards artificial intelligence. How does that provide value within this space, this domain called ESG? So some companies may deem ESG or ESG compliance to be elusive. And that's predominantly due to the fact that this landscape is continuously evolving. This domain of ESG is really marked by the myriad of frameworks that have competing priorities for organizations. So it becomes a bit of a challenge for organizations to become compliant. Cost of compliance is also deemed to be more on the high side. As indicated, data availability and integrity makes compliance a bit of a challenge because data is sitting all over the show. It's in different formats. It's not consistent. It's not available. So that poses risks pertaining to compliance. And where are companies focusing on? Are they focusing on long-term priorities or short-term priorities, taking into consideration resource limitations that are always there? So all these challenges pose significant risks to organizations. So this slide does not in any way depict the complexity of the ESG regulatory environment. But what it tends to do is to just, provide a holistic picture to say, in order for a framework to become compliant, it needs to consider pertinent regulations, those that are pertinent to the industry in which an organization operates, regulations that are pertinent to that organization, the laws, and there's a lot of those. And it even becomes it becomes even more complex when a company is a multinational entity. So you can imagine the number of laws, cross-border laws that an entity needs to comply with. However, that needs to be taken into consideration. Standards, quite key. So what is also pivotal when we're talking compliance is the compliance process from the time an entity identifies what is relevant, what is key. Okay, so the process itself, the compliance process is very key. From the time a company tries to understand its regulatory landscape and prioritizes the efforts to the time that the processes or the regulations have been translated into processes, into policies that are then embedded within an organization. The monitoring of activities, compliance-related activities, and then the tweaking of what is not working. So a sustainable ESG framework is underpinned by governance, by resources, and culture. Here, what is very pivotal is a robust and an informed, well-informed ESG strategy, well-informed by stakeholders, your regulators, employees, customers, the community as well. Well-informed by a materiality assessment. What also makes an ESG framework sustainable is a formidable tone at the top. The translation of regulations into guidelines, into standards, into policies that will then inform what needs to happen. The integration of ESG in business models, in this decision-making, in risk management frameworks, in compliance practices. Key to this are the metrics, the KPIs that talk to regulatory requirements, the monitoring of those, reporting, continuous reporting, and tweaking of what needs to be done towards sustainability goals. Also key to this is assurance, providing assurance on the activities that are undertaken and the information that is being disclosed so that, there's minimal greenwashing, as an example. Very key to a sustainable ESG framework are competencies, skills, highly skilled people within the domain of ESG. So training, upskilling of people is very important. As indicated, the integrity of data, the availability of data, the completeness of data is quite key. Technology, quite key as well, because it can play a role in ensuring seamless processes across an entity, meaning breaking silos and providing a holistic picture of what is really happening within an entity. Culture, very, very important. Who are we engaging with? Are we engaging all the stakeholders? And is that a rigorous process that we are undertaking? I spoke about ethics. Having an ethical conduct is quite key to mitigate litigation and reputational risk as well. That culture of continuous improvement will ensure that the framework is sustainable and goals are attained. A culture of innovation, having the right people who are continuously checking what is happening in the environment, making sense of what is happening and translating that into innovative solutions and services. I have touched on the integration of ESG in risk management. Here I'm basically saying that we need to take into cognizance all sorts of risks, but the materiality of risks differ from entity to another, from one entity to the other, and from one sector to the other. Materiality assessments are very important to chart the way forward on what an organization is going to be focusing on, and to make sure that key risks are mitigated. So how do we know that an ESG framework is competitive? It's when we see costs being reduced, when there are cost efficiencies, when the regulatory landscape becomes less onerous for an organization. So when that happens, when there's less complexity, there are minimal opportunities for an organization, or chances more like it, for an organizations to be called to regulators, to be asked to give a view on this or that, or one thing or the other, to account for this or for that. An ESG framework is competitive when there is revenue growth within an organization. When that framework is supported by experts that are, people that are well informed, that are highly skilled and innovative as well. And an ESG framework is competitive if it leads to sustained return on investment, optimal investments that derive value. So I'm not going to dwell too much on the nitty-gritties, but what I would like to highlight is that in developing an ESG framework, in developing a competitive, compliant, a sustainable ESG framework, an entity needs to consider the sustainable reporting process and determine what is important at what stage. From the time, material issues are identified, and as I said, through stakeholder engagements, to materiality assessments and so forth, to the time that information is being disclosed. So what an organization needs to determine is, what are those factors that need to be taken into consideration to make sure that the entire process is as effective and efficient as possible, coming up with a roadmap to make sure that what needs to be done, what needs to be complied with at the end of the day is complied with, and preempting what's coming, because that is another key thing to consider. So with regards to a maturing ESG capability, what is it that we need to take into consideration to move from level 1 to level 5, as an example? What are those factors that will enable an organization to move fast from the bottom of the model to, the higher levels? Governance is quite key, and I have spoken about all these. So all those factors that I've spoken about come into play in maturing an ESG capability. What is being discussed at board level? What are the priorities of the board? And how are those priorities delegated to board committees, to EXCO, to ESG forums or ESG teams, to make sure that what needs to happen actually happens? To what extent is ESG integrated in decision making, in risk management processes, in compliance processes, day-to-day processes, basically? And with regards to competence, does an organization have the right skills to enable it to attain its goals? I cannot emphasize culture enough. That is very key. Is ESG embedded in the DNA of an organization? Because that is one of those elements of factors that will enable an organization to move as quickly as possible to where it needs to go. I've spoken about data and technology. Is data available? Can it be relied upon? Is it comprehensive enough to make sure that it talks to all the KPIs that need to be complied with or reported on? And with regards to technology, has an organization adopted disruptive technologies, as an example, AI? Or is an organization still utilizing archaic technologies that don't lead to seamless integration of processes, that only allow a snapshot of ESG performance within an organization? So in closing, we reckon that a competitive, compliant, and sustainable ESG framework is achievable. And as I said, what I'm talking about relates to good corporate citizenship. So what I've just spoken about is not just about compliance, but it's a strategic imperative. With focused ESG efforts, we are able to create more resilient and responsible organizations. Thank you very much, everyone.